You were present, but only as a silhouette, a figure without weight, a soundless echo in the corridors of your own home. Growing up with a selfish mother means being emotionally orphaned in plain sight, not abandoned in the traditional sense. No, that would almost be a mercy, but rather disassembled slowly in fragments while still seated at the dinner table. She was there, yes. Her voice filled the room. Her presence was undeniable, but her attention was fixed inward, like someone hypnotized by their own reflection in the glass. You were not raised so much as you were tolerated. You became an accessory to her narrative, a prop that could be displayed when it served her image and hidden when it did not. The psychological violence of this isn't always loud. It's quiet, subtle, and persistent. You were not told directly that your needs didn't matter. That would have been too clear, too easy to fight. Instead, your needs were simply never acknowledged at all. Your hunger for affection, for guidance, for recognition, was met with distraction or dismissal. She had a way of making everything about her, even your pain, especially your pain. If you cried, she was the one who had a headache. If you failed, she was the one who was embarrassed. You learned early that her emotions occupied the throne, and yours were the dust on the floor. And in that distortion, something essential in you went underground. This is what I mean when I say you became an invisible child. You learned to edit yourself out of your own experience. You stopped speaking certain truths, not because you didn't feel them, but because there was no one on the receiving end. The silence became a strategy, a kind of psychic camouflage. You thought, perhaps unconsciously, if I take up less space, maybe she will love me more. If I need nothing, maybe I'll finally be enough. But this bargain is poison disguised as survival, and the tragedy is, you become so good at disappearing that you forget how to return. Even long after childhood, even into your relationships and adult decisions, you carry the shape of that vanishing act. You defer, you minimize, you apologize for existing in subtle and sometimes unnoticeable ways. Because deep in your nervous system, the equation still runs. Visibility equals risk. To be seen is to be used, or worse, to be punished. And so the child becomes an adult who still walks on emotional tiptoe, who distrusts their own needs, who finds intimacy overwhelming or even threatening. Not because they don't want love, but because love was once the leash that dragged them. What must be understood, what must be said plainly, is this: you were not invisible because you lacked value. You were invisible because her vision was terminally turned inward. That blindness was hers, not yours, and certainly not a measure of your worth. The time has come to reverse the roles, to raise yourself now with the honesty and tenderness you were denied, not out of resentment, but out of restoration. You owe it to the child you once were to finally be seen by the one person who always should have, you. Love, in its truest form, is given freely. It is not earned, negotiated, or held in escrow. But for the child of a selfish mother, love never arrives as a gift. It is always a transaction. A conditional exchange where affection is dangled like a prize, and the price is your compliance. You learn to perform, not to connect, to please, not to exist. And in this quiet economy of the soul, you begin to believe that your worth is measured solely by how useful you are to her moods, her image, her needs. This is not the kind of selfishness that throws dishes or slams doors. It's far more subtle and far more damaging. It shows up in the way she smiles when you're convenient and withdraws when you're not. The way her praise is loaded with expectation. "You're such a good girl," becomes shorthand for "you didn't make my life harder today." Her version of love trains you to anticipate, to bend, to disappear in the places where you once had agency. You become fluent in decoding her emotional temperature before you even understand your own. Her happiness becomes your responsibility, and her disappointment your shame. And then something even stranger happens. You begin to feel guilty when she's pleased, because you know what it cost you. You know what small truth you had to betray, what desire you had to swallow, in order to earn that flicker of approval. You become suspicious of love itself, because it always arrives with strings. Her affection is not a refuge, it's a test. And you will fail it again and again simply by being a person with needs. It's not just that love was withheld, it's that it was weaponized, used to control, to manipulate, to remind you that even your most vulnerable moments could be turned into leverage. You didn't cry in front of her for comfort. You cried and watched her make it about her. Your suffering became her inconvenience, and so you learned to suffer silently, to expect nothing, to find safety in self-erasure. This form of upbringing doesn't just distort your relationship with your mother, it warps your relationship with everyone. You carry this ledger with you into adulthood, subconsciously calculating what you owe in exchange for kindness. You question whether people truly care or are just waiting for their turn to collect. Even the softest gestures can feel suspicious, because somewhere deep inside, you're still waiting for the bill to arrive. But here's the unbearable truth. Love isn't supposed to feel like debt. It's not meant to be conditional upon your silence, your usefulness, or your obedience. The child in you was never meant to audition for affection. You deserved it just by being alive. To heal, you must stop paying for love that should have been yours freely. You must stop treating relationships like balance sheets. Let the debt die with her illusion of motherhood. The real mother, the one you needed, might never have existed, but you exist, and you are not a transaction. Reclaim your right to be loved without negotiation. Burn the contract you never agreed to. Let your worth stand without price. Guilt is a natural consequence of wrongdoing, unless, of course, you were taught to feel guilty simply for existing. When you grow up with a selfish mother, guilt becomes the wallpaper of your inner world. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because you were made to believe that your very presence was somehow too much. You breathed too loud, needed too often, cried at the wrong time, and slowly, imperceptibly, your innocence was converted into a kind of shame. Not the kind that follows a mistake, but the kind that precedes any action at all. You learned to apologize before speaking, to scan every situation for signs of displeasure, to carry the blame for moods you didn't create. If she was angry, it was because of something you did. If she was tired, it was because you needed too much. If she was cold, then you failed to make her feel warm. Her emotions, erratic, unchecked, often contradictory, were deposited in your psyche like a foreign currency. And even though you never understood the exchange rate, you always paid in full. This is what happens when a child becomes the emotional caretaker of a parent. The roles reverse, and the burden shifts in ways a young mind can't articulate. You don't say, "My mother is unstable," because you can't. So instead you say, "I must be bad." It's the only logic available to a mind still forming its sense of self. And over time, this narrative hardens. You come to believe that love must be earned, but that guilt is a birthright. You carry it like a second spine, quiet but always there to bend you. And the tragedy is, this guilt doesn't fade with age. It travels with you, into friendships, into work, into love. You say yes when you mean no. You comfort others while silently crumbling. You feel responsible for emotions that were never yours to manage. Because somewhere inside the child still believes, if I can just be better, maybe I'll finally deserve peace. But that peace never comes, because it was never about you being bad. It was about her being unable, or unwilling, to see you as separate from her own needs. Her chaos was not your fault, though she made you feel it was. And the sooner you can distinguish between inherited guilt and actual responsibility, the sooner you can begin to breathe without apology. This is the work, to unlearn the reflex of self-blame to stand inside your own skin and declare that you are not the sum of someone else's dissatisfaction. Your mother's unhappiness was not a judgment. It was a condition she refused to treat. And it is not your duty to cure what you did not cause. You are not guilty for being born. You are not guilty for needing love. You are not guilty for surviving the story she tried to trap you in. What you are, in fact, is free to write another one. A story without inherited shame. One where your existence is not an error, but a declaration. There's a particular kind of damage that occurs when the mirror held up to you is warped. When the first person tasked with showing you who you are, the one who should reflect back your humanity, your growing complexity, gives you instead a shattered portrait of yourself, filtered through her distortions, her fears, her unmet needs. You begin to see yourself not as you are, but as she needs you to be, the quiet one, the obedient one, the grateful one. A role, not a person, a character in her drama, not a child with a developing soul. You don't realize the mirror is broken at first. How could you? You have no other point of reference. So when she says you're selfish for wanting time alone, you believe it. When she calls you dramatic for crying, you believe that too. You start to mistrust your own perceptions, your instincts. Your feelings become suspect even to yourself. And this is how the real theft happens. Not of your time, not of your youth, but of your identity. Because the more you see yourself through her lens, the more estranged you become from your own reflection. And that kind of alienation is devastating. It's not just confusing, it's paralyzing. You begin to ask questions like, am I difficult? Am I ungrateful? Am I wrong for wanting more? And each time you ask, her voice answers, not yours. Her internal narrative becomes your internal monologue. She becomes the judge, the jury, and eventually the architect of your self-concept. This isn't love. This is colonization of the self. It's one thing to be misunderstood by the world. That happens. But to be misrepresented by the person who is supposed to know you best, that can fracture the psyche. You start to perform, to contort, to adapt not for survival, but for permission. Permission to feel okay. Permission to be seen without being punished. But that permission never lasts, because the approval was never about you. It was always about how well you upheld her illusion. And the most tragic part is, over time, you begin to internalize the distortions. You look into real mirrors and still see her version of you. You question compliments. You sabotage your successes. You shrink in the face of genuine affection. Not because you want to, but because deep down, part of you still believes you are unworthy of being seen accurately. But the truth is far simpler and more liberating. You were never the person she claimed you were. Her disappointment was not proof of your failure. It was a symptom of her blindness. Her inability to love you wasn't about your lack of value. It was about her inability to see beyond herself. You do not owe your reflection to anyone else's approval. You are not a product of someone's narrative. You are a person, whole, incomplete, evolving. So now the task is this: shatter her mirror, pick up the fragments of your identity and hold them up to the light. Piece by piece, build a reflection that is finally your own. And when you look into that mirror, don't search for perfection, search for truth. When you grow up with a selfish mother, speech becomes a gamble. Words don't function as tools for connection. They become liabilities. The simple act of saying how you feel, what you need, or even what you think begins to carry risk. Not because your voice is wrong, but because her response is unpredictable. Maybe you'll be mocked. Maybe you'll be met with cold silence. Maybe she'll twist your words into an accusation against her. Over time, you stop expressing not out of choice, but out of exhaustion. You don't grow quieter because you want peace. You grow quieter because you've learned that peace depends on your silence. This is the tyranny of the unspoken. You become fluent in a language of suppression, where discomfort is swallowed, opinions are edited mid-thought, and your true self remains locked behind carefully constructed phrases. You're not even lying. You're just curating constantly. making sure that nothing you say could be misinterpreted, used against you, or worse, ignored. And the longer you do this, the more your voice becomes unfamiliar, even to yourself. You forget what it feels like to speak plainly without flinching. The most tragic thing about this is not just that your voice is suppressed, but that you begin to see it as dangerous. You start believing that silence is your shield, that invisibility is safety, that if you can just stay small, stay agreeable, stay mute, maybe you can avoid the next storm. But that storm is never far, is it? Because it was never really about what you said. It was about who you were, and how inconvenient that was to her narrative. So you carry this habit forward? Into classrooms, into relationships, into meetings, into late night conversations with people who genuinely want to know you, and even then, even when safety is finally present, you hesitate. You soften your words, test the ground before speaking, apologize before voicing a need. And people say you're reserved or shy or private. But you know better. You're not hiding because you're secretive. You're hiding because you were taught that exposure leads to punishment. But here's the thing. You can only suppress your voice for so long before it starts to rot. Unspoken feelings don't disappear. They ferment. They turn into anxiety, into resentment, into self-doubt that coils around your inner life like ivy choking a tree. Silence, in this context, is not calm, it's corrosion. And eventually, something in you begins to ache for the release of authenticity, even if it risks everything. That ache is not rebellion, it's recovery. The path forward isn't easy. It requires relearning how to speak, not just loudly, but honestly. To express without preemptive guilt, to trust that your voice has the right to exist, even if it trembles, especially when it trembles. You weren't born silent, you were silenced, and now, slowly, sentence by sentence, you must return to yourself. Speak even when it feels dangerous. Speak because it does. Let your voice be imperfect, raw, uncertain, but let it be yours. Because freedom begins the moment you decide that silence is no longer your home. What do you do with all of this? The invisibility, the guilt, the distorted mirror, the silence that wrapped itself around your childhood like fog refusing to lift. What now? What becomes of the adult who has spent years surviving a mother who lived in orbit around herself, pulling everything, including you, into her gravitational center? The answer isn't simple. It rarely is. But it always begins in the same place. The decision to stop waiting for a repair that will never come. If you are still hoping for her to acknowledge the damage, to change, to finally give you the version of love you needed, I must tell you, gently but firmly, that this hope is a trap disguised as loyalty. She will not become who she should have been. That version of her exists only in the blueprint of your longing, and that longing, left unchecked, becomes a form of self-abandonment. You have to stop looking for the mother you never had and start becoming the guardian you always needed. This means stepping into a role you were never prepared for, reparenting yourself, not as a trend or an affirmation, but as an act of existential repair. You must now be the one who sees you, hears you, protects you. The one who says, you don't need to earn rest. You don't need to justify your needs. You are allowed to exist. This may sound abstract, but it isn't. It's 1,000 small decisions, choosing to say no without apology, to sit with your emotions instead of silencing them, to speak even when your voice shakes. It's building a self not from fragments of her approval, but from the raw material of your own truth. And here's something you need to understand. Healing doesn't mean erasing the past. It means refusing to let it dictate the future. The pain you carry isn't a disqualifier, it's a portal. You survived not because you were weak, but because you were adaptable. And that same adaptability can now become resilience if you direct it inward instead of outward. You're allowed to be angry, you're allowed to mourn, you're allowed to name what happened, and you're allowed to grow beyond it. Not to spite her, but to rescue yourself, because healing isn't vengeance, it's reclamation. You are reclaiming your narrative from the ruins of someone else's limitations. This path is not linear. There will be days when the silence creeps back in, when the old guilt knocks at the door dressed in new clothes. But every time you choose yourself, even quietly, you weaken the hold of the past. And so I'll leave you with this. The mother you needed may not have come. But you are here, breathing, awake, capable of becoming the one who finally listens, the one who stays. You are not what she failed to see. You are what rises in the absence, not a shadow of her neglect, but the author of your own becoming.